The most feared man in New Orleans had not slept in 11 days, not since his daughter stopped walking. Darius Kohl controlled the freight corridors of the Gulf Coast the way other men controlled their living rooms, absolutely, without negotiation, without exception. He had built his operation from a single warehouse on the south bank of the Mississippi into a syndicate that moved product worth $250 million annually through the port of New Orleans. Prosecutors had spent 16 years trying to put him in a federal cell. They had failed every time. Judges reconsidered, witnesses relocated, evidence dissolved. But Darius Kohl could not negotiate with a blood test. He could not intimidate a declining kidney panel, and he could not pay enough money to make the numbers on his daughter, Eloise's chart, move in the right direction. Eloise was 7 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's relentless stubbornness. 3 weeks ago she had been healthy, running through the courtyard of their Garden District home, terrorizing the housekeeper's cat, demanding Darius read her 3 chapters before bed instead of 1. Then, slowly, so slowly that it almost seemed like imagination, she had begun to fade. Fatigue first, then nausea, then her legs had simply given out during a soccer game, and the blood work that followed had sent 3 different pediatricians pale and silent. Progressive kidney failure, acute tubular necrosis, etiology unclear. The 8th floor of Tulane Medical Center had been quietly reorganized within 48 hours. 4 men in dark clothing stood at the elevator banks. Another 2 flanked the stairwell doors. The nursing staff had been screened and cross-referenced against background databases Darius maintained independently. The chief of pediatric nephrology, Dr. Ambrose Taft, had been flown in from Johns Hopkins with a consulting fee that could have bought a sailboat. None of it was working. Ingrid Farrow noticed all of it on her first shift on the 8th floor and filed it under not my problem. She was 31 years old, built like someone who had spent a decade doing things the hard way, with the kind of stillness that came not from peace but from discipline. She had transferred to Tulane's nephrology ward 6 weeks ago from a position in Baton Rouge, and before that, though it was not on the version of her resume she handed to hospital HR, she had spent 8 years as a critical care specialist attached to the 82nd Airborne's Medical Battalion. 3 deployments: Kandahar, Mosul, Kunduz. She had performed field surgery with a headlamp and a Leatherman, and she had brought men back from conditions that should have killed them. She was not intimidated by men with guns. She was, however, deeply interested in a child who was dying without a satisfying reason. Eloise Kohl had been admitted 12 days ago. Ingrid had read the chart the night she transferred in, not because anyone assigned it to her, but because she was that kind of nurse. The kind who could not let a mystery sit unexamined, and Eloise's case was a mystery. The lab values said renal failure, progressive, worsening, textbook in presentation. But the pattern underneath the numbers did not sit right with Ingrid. Acute tubular necrosis had a profile. There should be cast cells in the urine, specific protein signatures, a correlating bun to creatinine ratio that followed logic. Eloise's panels were wrong in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. She asked Dr. Taft about it during rounds on her 3rd day. Dr. Taft was 62, silver-haired, impeccably groomed, and accustomed to being the most credentialed person in any room he entered. He looked at Ingrid the way professors look at students who ask questions, revealing they have read something they were not assigned. The panels are consistent with idiopathic ATN in a pediatric patient, he said, his tone smooth and dismissive. The variability you're observing falls within normal range for her age group. It didn't, and they both knew it. Ingrid did not argue. She went back to her station and started making notes in the margin of her own copy of the chart, which she kept in her locker because she was not supposed to have it. Darius Kohl did not speak to nurses directly. He spoke through his head of security, a former DEA agent named Breck, who served as the functional buffer between the syndicate boss and the rest of the world. When Eloise needed something, Breck conveyed it. When the doctors had updates, they delivered them to Breck, who relayed them in abbreviated form. The system broke down on the evening of the 12th day. Darius had been standing at the window of Eloise's room for 4 hours, not speaking, not eating the food someone had brought and left on the bedside table, just watching his daughter's chest rise and fall with the slow, labored rhythm of something being extinguished. Ingrid had come in to check the dialysis settings. Eloise had started dialysis 2 days ago, 3 sessions a week, each one leaving her smaller and more exhausted than the last, and she had adjusted the flow rate without looking at Darius, because she was focused on the machine and the numbers, and whether the potassium reading made sense, given what the morning panel had shown. She lost 400 grams since yesterday, Darius said. His voice was low and flat, clearly not addressed to anyone in particular, but Ingrid answered it anyway. "I know," she said, still looking at the dialysis monitor. "The weight loss is the piece that's bothering me." A pause. She could feel him turn to look at her. "Bothering you," he repeated. She finally looked at him. Darius Kohl was not what she had expected, and she had expected something considerable. He was tall, broad, with the kind of face that had spent equal time outdoors and in boardrooms. He looked at this particular moment like a man being hollowed out from the inside with a slow instrument. "The kidney failure is real," Ingrid said, because she had learned that certain people, the kind who built empires and sent other men's fear back to them as a gift, responded better to directness than to softness. But the weight loss doesn't match the failure profile. Renal patients lose weight differently. Eloise is losing it the wrong way. Darius studied her. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to figure it out." She finished with the dialysis machine and left before he could respond. Behind her, she heard the quietest thing she had ever heard a man of his type produce. A single exhaled breath that sounded like a prayer addressed to no one. Ingrid started pulling reference literature that night. Not on the hospital system. She used her personal laptop and the medical database login she still had from her graduate school days at Tulane's nursing program. She was looking for conditions that mimicked acute tubular necrosis in pediatric patients, but presented with a different weight loss signature. Heavy metal poisoning appeared in the differential at 2 in the morning. She sat back and read the article twice. Thallium. It was a soft, toxic metal, tasteless, colorless, nearly odorless, that had been used historically as a rat poison before being banned for consumer use in the United States. It attacked the kidneys first, then the nervous system. Administered in subacute doses, it could mimic renal failure with terrifying precision. The tubular damage was real. Thallium caused genuine renal injury, but the cellular mechanism was entirely different, and a standard renal panel would never catch it. You needed a 24-hour urine thallium assay or an ICP-MS analysis. Neither had been ordered, because no one had thought to order them. Ingrid pulled up Eloise's timeline. Onset of symptoms had begun approximately 22 days ago. She cross-referenced this against the family's recent activity, not because she had formal access to it, but because nurses on the previous 2 shifts had been talking the way nurses always talked in the break room during handoff. And she had listened. The Kohl family had returned from a week-long trip to a private island compound in the Bahamas 3 weeks ago, a private charter, private catering, private water supply. Someone with access to that trip had access to Eloise Kohl. She looked at the dialysis data again. The dialysis was slowing Eloise's decline but not reversing it. If thallium was the source and exposure was ongoing, it would explain why Eloise kept losing ground despite aggressive treatment. The chelation therapy that would actually bind and remove thallium from the body had never been started because thallium had never been considered. If Ingrid was right, Eloise was still being poisoned. She closed her laptop and sat in the dark for a long moment, listening to the hum of the hospital around her. Then she went to find the specimen she needed. The toxicology lab was on the 3rd floor, and it was not empty at 3 in the morning the way it would have been in a smaller facility. Tulane ran continuous processing. But the tech on duty was a second-year resident named Cresswell, who had headphones in and a paperback open, and did not look up when Ingrid badged through the door. She used the ICP-MS herself. She had run the instrument before. It was the same model they had used in the battalion's field toxicology unit, a fact that continued to be useful in ways her nursing school professors would have found surprising. She had pulled a urine sample from Eloise's collection bag before leaving the floor, properly catalogued, properly labeled, technically within protocol. She fed it through the machine and waited. 18 minutes. The readout printed in narrow columns of numbers, and Ingrid read it from the top and did not look away until she reached the thallium line. 214 micrograms per liter. The reference range for a healthy child was less than 2. She pressed her palm flat against the counter and stood very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then she thought about the Bahamas trip and about who had access to it, and she thought about Dr. Taft's particular brand of deliberate incuriosity. And she thought about the fact that Eloise Kohl had been getting worse for 3 weeks, despite the best nephrologist money could hire. She folded the printout carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her scrub top. Darius Kohl was not in the waiting room when she came back upstairs. His head of security, Breck, told her the boss was in the family consultation room at the end of the hall. Ingrid walked to it, knocked twice, and went in without waiting for an answer. Darius was standing at the window. His older brother, Sterling Kohl, was seated in one of the upholstered chairs with a glass of water, and he looked up when Ingrid entered with the mild irritation of a man who had expected to be alone. Sterling was 54, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had once been pleasant and had calcified into something harder over the years. He had co-founded the syndicate with Darius 2 decades ago and held the legal side of the operation. The shell companies, the port-import licenses, the legitimate business layer that made everything else possible. He was wearing a very good suit and an expression of appropriate fraternal concern. "I need to speak with Mr. Kohl," Ingrid said, privately. Darius turned from the window. Sterling set down his glass. "Nurse, whatever you have to say about Eloise's condition, you can say it in front of me. I'm family." Ingrid looked at Darius, not at Sterling. "Privately," she said again. Something shifted in Darius Kohl's face. He was a man who had spent a lifetime reading rooms and the people in them. He looked at Ingrid's expression, and then, very briefly, at the place where her hand rested against the front of her scrub top. "Sterling," he said, "give us a minute." Sterling's pleasant expression did not change, but something underneath it tightened. "Of course," he said, and stood and left with the easy grace of a man who had nothing to be concerned about. The door closed. Darius crossed the room in 4 steps. "Talk." Ingrid pulled out the printout and handed it to him. She gave him 30 seconds to read it, then explained it in the clearest terms she knew. Thallium, the mechanism, the mimicry, the fact that Eloise's dialysis was addressing the symptoms while the source continued to accumulate in her system. If she stays on the current treatment protocol without chelation, Ingrid said, she has roughly 72 hours before the renal damage becomes irreversible. Possibly less. Darius Kohl's jaw set in a way she recognized, the way it set in men who had taken a bad wound and were deciding in real time whether to be afraid of it or furious at it. "Who?" he said, not a question, a verdict waiting to be filled in. "I don't know yet," Ingrid said, "but someone with access to your daughter on that island trip. Someone who knew she would eat and drink from a private supply that could be controlled. The exposure window matches the timeline from the Bahamas to symptom onset, and Dr. Taft." She paused. "Dr. Taft is either the least curious nephrologist I have ever encountered, or he has a reason to not look too hard." Darius picked up his phone. "Don't," Ingrid said. He stopped. "If you contact anyone right now, if you do anything that signals to whoever is responsible that you know what's happening, they will either accelerate the timeline or cover their tracks well enough that you will never prove it. and you will lose every chance of starting the chelation that can actually save Eloise. She held his gaze without flinching. I need 24 hours, and I need you to act like everything is exactly the same as it was an hour ago. Darius Kohl was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that came from a man calculating at a very high rate. How do I start the chelation without Taft realizing it? He asked. Let me handle that, Ingrid said. Prussian blue can be administered as an oral compound. I can manage Eloise's intake myself without it appearing on Taft's radar. By morning, her levels should start dropping. And the source, Darius said, if she's still being exposed. I'm going to find the source, Ingrid said. Give me the night. She did not find it that night. She found something better. At 2:30, she was in the hospital's administrative corridor near the parking level. She had gone down to check whether Dr. Taft's car was still in the lot, which it was, which meant he had not gone home, which was unusual for a man of his schedule, when she heard voices from the alcove beside the loading dock. She recognized one of them immediately. Sterling Kohl's voice was distinctive. The particular cadence, the way it rounded its vowels even under pressure. She pressed herself behind a column of supply shelving and did not move. The other voice belonged to Dr. Taft. She's stabilizing on the dialysis, Dr. Taft was saying. Not improving, but stabilizing. Darius is going to start asking questions about the timeline. Then we increase the dose, Sterling said. I need her declining again by Friday. If she plateaus, Darius focuses. I need him broken, not observant. There are limits to what I can. I'm paying you $300,000 to not have limits, Ambrose. Sterling's voice had shed its pleasantness entirely. It was very flat and very precise. Eloise dies, Darius collapses. A man who has lost his wife and his only child in the same year does not run a syndicate. He signs transfer papers. I've been waiting 15 years for the port licenses to pass through hands I actually control. Don't get philosophical with me now. Ingrid had her phone out before she made a conscious decision to reach for it. She recorded 51 seconds of audio before the men moved away from the loading dock and back toward the elevator banks. She stood in the dark of the supply alcove and felt the particular clarity that combat had always produced in her. The sensation of everything unnecessary falling away, leaving only what mattered and what needed to happen next. Sterling Kohl was poisoning his niece to destroy his brother. Ingrid pocketed her phone and went back upstairs. Darius was in Eloise's room when she returned, standing in the same place she had found him the night before. He had aged approximately a decade in the past 12 hours. She told him what she had recorded. She played it for him once. She watched his face as he heard his brother's voice use his daughter's name with the casual arithmetic of a real estate transaction. Darius Kohl's expression did not break. What happened instead was more frightening. It became entirely still, the way water stills before it reflects something with perfect clarity. He stood without moving for 30 seconds. Then he took a slow breath. Then he looked at Ingrid. I need to make calls, he said. Not until tomorrow morning, Ingrid said. You call anyone tonight, Sterling will know something has shifted. He built the legal infrastructure for this organization. He knows how evidence works, and he'll know to move. She pressed on before Darius could object. Tomorrow morning, you're going to invite Sterling to meet with your senior partners. Tell him you've decided to step back from operations. Tell him you're not well. Make him come to the table believing he has already won. Darius was quiet for a moment, and then you play the recording in front of everyone who needs to hear it. She watched him think through it, the full architecture of it, every angle and variable. She had seen commanders do this. The ones who were truly dangerous were never the ones who moved fastest. They were the ones who moved right. Eloise, he said finally, the chelation. I started it about an hour ago, Ingrid said, before we even had this conversation. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had met Darius Kohl, something in his expression genuinely moved. Not gratitude exactly, not quite, but the immediate precursor to it. The moment when a person realizes they are not as alone as they believe themselves to be. "Why would you do any of this?" he said. It was not accusatory. It was a genuine question from a man unaccustomed to actions that did not carry a legible price tag. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Ingrid looked past him toward the bed where Eloise lay sleeping, her small chest rising and falling with the slow, measured steadiness of a body that had not yet given up. "She's 7 years old," Ingrid said, "and she's my patient, that's the entire reason." The meeting in the conference room on the 32nd floor of the Kohl Group's Canal Street building happened at 9 the next morning. Sterling arrived with the controlled satisfaction of a man collecting something he had waited a long time to receive. Darius was already in the room, along with 6 men whose authority within the organization was unambiguous and unspoken. They were the kind of men who did not need to say much. Sterling spoke for 3 minutes about the challenges of leadership under prolonged emotional duress. He spoke with genuine, if measured, concern. He was preparing the ground carefully, methodically, the way he had always done everything. Darius let him finish. Then he placed Ingrid's phone on the conference table, connected it to the room's audio system, and pressed play. Sterling Kohl's voice filled the room. "I need her declining again by Friday. If she plateaus, Darius focuses. I need him broken, not observant." The 6 men at the table listened to every word. When the recording ended, the room held the kind of silence that precedes a sentence rather than a conversation. Sterling had gone completely white. The pleasant architecture of his face had collapsed under the weight of being heard clearly, in full, by people who understood exactly what they were hearing. "That's taken out of context," he started. "Ambrose and I were discussing the medication schedule." "Dr. Taft gave a full statement at 7 this morning," Darius said quietly. "He had a long night." Sterling looked around the table. He found nothing. No ambiguity, no doubt. Not one face that was willing to offer him any room. 2 of the men stood and took positions on either side of Sterling's chair with the efficiency of people who had performed this particular action before. Sterling's hand moved instinctively toward the inside of his jacket and stopped when he counted the number of men in the room against the number of options remaining to him. "Darius." Sterling's voice cracked through its composure at last. "We're blood. We built this together from nothing. You have to." "You put thallium in your niece's water," Darius said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She is 7 years old, Sterling. You poisoned a 7-year-old child who calls you uncle." The men guided Sterling out of the room. The door closed. Darius Kohl sat at the head of the table in the silence that followed and pressed both hands flat against the wood and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and called the 8th floor of Tulane Medical Center. "How is she?" he asked. Ingrid was at the nursing station, looking at Eloise's morning labs. The thallium level had dropped to 58 micrograms per liter, still far too high, but moving in the right direction for the first time in 3 weeks. "She ate this morning," Ingrid said. "Real food. Scrambled eggs and half a piece of toast. She told me the toast was too crunchy and that her father never burns it." Darius was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment. "That's a good sign," Ingrid said. "That's a very good sign." "Yes," he said in a voice she had not heard from him before. "Something underneath the granite older and much simpler. It is." Dr. Ambrose Taft surrendered his medical license before the board could formally convene. The federal indictment for conspiracy to commit murder and criminal endangerment of a child came 7 weeks later. He negotiated a plea and accepted 19 years at Allenwood Federal Correctional Institution. He would be 81 years old upon release, assuming good behavior, which the conditions of his incarceration were not designed to encourage. Sterling Kohl's fate was not the kind that moved through federal courts. Eloise Kohl was discharged from Tulane Medical Center on a Thursday in October, 11 weeks after her admission, with clean panels and a resting kidney function her new nephrologist described, unprompted, as remarkable. She walked out of the hospital on her own feet, which she pointed out to everyone present several times, with the particular emphasis of a 7-year-old who understood that this was significant without having been told precisely why. Ingrid Farrow was near the elevator bank when the Kohl family came through. She had a chart under her arm and had not planned to be there. She had a full floor to manage and 2 other patients whose morning labs needed her attention. But she had noted the discharge time that morning and arranged to be passing through. Eloise spotted her first. "That's the nurse who fixed me," she announced to the lobby, with the volume and confidence of someone who had been in bed for 11 weeks and had a great deal of stored energy to deploy. Darius Kohl stopped walking. He looked at Ingrid across the lobby floor, and she looked back at him. He was not the man she had met 11 weeks ago, not the hollowed-out figure standing at a hospital window in the dark. He was something harder than that, and something more human at the same time, which was not a combination she had anticipated. "Nurse Farrow," he said. "Mr. Kohl," she said. "I owe you a debt." He said it the way she imagined he said very few things, with the full unvarnished weight of what those words meant coming from him. "You don't," Ingrid said. "She was my patient. Everything I did for her." Eloise tugged at her father's hand with the decisive impatience of someone who had been in a hospital for 11 weeks and had formed a strong and immediate opinion about leaving it. Darius let his daughter pull him toward the door, but he held Ingrid's gaze a moment longer before he went. "Nevertheless," he said. 3 months later, a letter arrived through Tulane's administration, informing the hospital that an anonymous donor had established a fully funded toxicology research fellowship in the pediatric nephrology division. The only one of its kind in Louisiana, dedicated specifically to developing standard diagnostic protocols for heavy metal poisoning in pediatric patients. The fellowship would support 2 researchers annually and was funded in perpetuity. Ingrid read the letter once at the nurse's station, set it down and went back to her rounds. There was a child in room 6 whose morning numbers were not adding up the way they should, and she had a theory she wanted to test before the shift changed.